Hello and welcome to Talking Finance. I'm Alan Kohler. And of course, this week it's all about the budget. Last night, and for the first time in, I think, about 40 years, I was not in the lockup. So like other people out who aren't journalists, I had to watch the speech on the telly and then sit down and write something through the evening. So it wasn't a normal process for me. But anyway, it was interesting and I did come up with something around about midnight. But I'm going to talk to a couple of people who did that as well, who were not in the lockup. Saul Eslake, the independent economist who lives in Hobart, used to be ANZ's chief economist, gives us his take on it and a bit about modern monetary theory and how the budget fits into that. Gareth Aird, head of Australian economics at CBA, basically tells us about the credibility of the government's economic forecasts and how that fits in. And for the politics, we turn to the inimitable Laura Tingle, chief political correspondent for 730, and she also writes for the Financial Review. And the first question for her is whether this is an election budget. And now here's Saul Eslake, independent economist. Well, Saul, what do you think of the budget?
Well, it was an inherently political budget, as budgets almost always are to at least some degree, but at least in this context, what's good from a political point of view is also, I think, appropriate from the standpoint of good economic policy. And so I think, broadly speaking, it was right for the government to have held back from the task of discretionary budget repair for at least another year, and instead to have provided some further stimulus for an economy that's done well, to be sure, but is still quite some way from where we ultimately want it to be. And so while I can quibble with individual measures in the budget, I have no criticism of its overall shape.
I was struck by a graph on page 101 of the of budget paper number 1, which is the structural budget balance, and it sort of projects out to 2031, 32, and the structural budget deficit continues until then. I mean, and beyond that. I mean, so and it's according to this graph at least goes back to 2010. So you know, we will be in structural deficit for at least 20 years, probably longer. Does that matter?
It doesn't in the short term, and it's interesting if you look at that chart closely, which I actually was just before we began this conversation. It's striking not only that, as you say, there are structural budget deficits out as far as the eye can see, that is out to the 2031-32 year, but interestingly, this budget has actually made those structural deficits worse. Now, the definition of structural balance that the government uses in this chart excludes not only the usual so-called cyclical effects of fluctuations in economic activity and asset prices and commodity prices on revenues and spending, but they've also taken out the temporary, tailored and targeted measures that the government introduced since March last year in direct response to the pandemic. And what doing that highlights is the significant contribution to the structural deficit that some of the spending decisions that were announced in the budget actually make. And that's in particular, of course, the significant increase in spending on aged care, but also the additional spending on the National Disability Insurance Program, on childcare, on infrastructure, and at least some of the extensions to some of the tax breaks that were introduced or originally as part of the 2019 tax package, the first of the three-stage program that the Morrison government went to the 2019 election on. All of these things worsen the structural deficit. Now, in the near term, when the government's goal is, like that of the Reserve Banks, to get the unemployment rate down to 4 point something or lower, that's not inappropriate. But over the longer term, if we're going to have increased spending on things like health and aged care, ultimately we're going to have to figure out how we're going to pay for those collectively and who individually is going to pay for them.
So, I mean, this is possibly a big question, Saul, but if we've got, structural budget deficits for as far as the eye can see, as you put it. Does that mean we're into modern monetary theory?
No, it doesn't, because the government is financing those deficits by borrowing from the financial markets. And although some people would say, well, the fact that the Reserve Bank is buying a lot of second-hand bonds from the financial markets, and as the Reserve Bank itself has acknowledged in some weeks, it's buying more from the financial markets than the government is borrowing from the financial markets by issuing new bonds. At the end of the day, the decision as to how much bonds the Reserve Bank buys is a decision that's being made by the Reserve Bank, not by the government, whereas one of the central tenets of so-called modern monetary theory is that the decision as to whether the central bank buys any bonds at all, and the decision as to how much they buy, and the decision as to for how long they keep buying it, is one that's made by politicians rather than the Reserve Bank. So while I don't quibble with one of the central propositions of modern monetary theory, that in circumstances where there's a lot of spare capacity in the economy, as there is at the moment, printing money by a central bank to finance government spending need not be inflationary. I think that's true. The reservation I have about so-called modern monetary theory is that I don't trust politicians to make those decisions, especially I don't trust politicians to make sound decisions as to when the time to stop doing it has passed. And there's plenty of history, and I'm not talking about Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe or Hugo Chavez's Venezuela, let alone 1923 Germany when I say that. But there are plenty of other examples which demonstrate quite clearly that entrusting that decision to people who need to get re-elected is a very dangerous thing to do.
So the Treasurer in this budget has said, we're going to put off austerity and budget repair. Do you think we should, particularly if they win the next election, brace ourselves for budget repair beyond that?
Yes, at some point we will need to reduce that structural budget deficit. We can put it off for a while, and indeed we should put it off for a while unemployment is still significantly higher than we want it to be. And I think it's a good thing that we want unemployment to be lower than we had previously regarded as being consistent with full employment, that is somewhere around 5%. I think there's now a considerable body of evidence, particularly out of the United States, but also out of Australia's experience in the years leading up to the onset of the pandemic, that says that full employment, or the so-called non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, is consistent with a much lower unemployment rate than we had previously thought. And it would be wrong to stop short of finding out what that unemployment rate actually is and striving to get the economy to that point and keep it there. So, I think it's right for the government to have postponed that task, and the fact that interest rates are so low, and in particular that the rate of interest the government is paying on its debt is below the rate of growth in nominal GDP, means that the deficits that the government is currently running are sustainable. They're not leading to an ultimately unsustainable increase in the level of public debt. And indeed, the government's own projections show that the level of net debt as a proportion of GDP will actually peak in the middle of this decade and gradually decline. Now, I think we need to do better than that over the medium term, not least so that if we strike another great big pothole like we have done in the last 12 months, we have the capacity to do something similar to what we've done over the last 12 months. And that means we do at some point need to contemplate some combination of revenue increases and spending reductions, but we just simply don't need to do that with any great urgency in the next year or so. That happens to be politically convenient as well for a government that's less than 12 months out from an election, but that doesn't make it wrong.
Thanks, Saul.
That's a pleasure.